All right, here is our first video on e-learning. I know this is kind of crazy, but we're just all going to do the best we can. This first video is going to be on absolute value, and for one of my classes, this is going to be a review, so that's good. It's been a week or so since we've done this. For my other class, you haven't learned this yet, so for our first kind of lesson, we're going to do our absolute value equations and review this. I do want to point out real quick, you're going to need some type of calculator. There are a ton of phone apps. I know TI, Texas Instruments, is working on getting a Chromebook extension free for all schools that will have this exact calculator that we use in class on it, the TI-84 Plus. But if you just search on the Google or the Android marketplace or the App Store for iPhones, there's quite a few different calculator apps. Just find one that you like. For the iPhone, I found Calculator X84 is pretty good and similar to the calculator we use in class. I think that is also available on Android. If you can't find a good calculator, just let me know. I'll help you. And if they do come out with a Chromebook extension, I'll let you know. All right, starting off, what is absolute value? And just like always, feel free to pause if I'm going too fast. If you need to write down a definition, feel free to pause the video, rewind, do whatever you need to do to make sure you stay caught up. All right, so absolute value. And this is in your pretest. It says define absolute value in at least two different ways. The most common is probably this one at the top, distance from some number x to 0. The absolute value of x is the distance from 0. Okay, and then this one here, it's kind of a roundabout way of making a number positive. We know that absolute values are always positive. For example, if I do the absolute value of -2, what that's asking me is how far away is the number -2 from 0. And we always measure distance in positive units. So I would say it's 2 units away. So therefore, the absolute value of -2 is 2. It's a distance from 0. So if I use that same example here, if I do the absolute value of -2, this is kind of just a roundabout way of making a number positive. So if I take -2 squared, we know that a negative number squared is positive, so we'd get 4. And we know the square root of 4 is 2, or the primary root is 2. So therefore, the absolute value of -2 is 2. So if I were you, I would remember these two. So for our exam number 3, which I'm assuming we'll take at some point, I still need to check with UMKC about logistics on that, but I would assume at some point, because UMKC is continuing, that we will continue to take our exams. So I just don't know what that's going to look like yet. But for the exam, I would remember those two. There's also this third option, and it's kind of splits the absolute value into the different possibilities. So if the absolute value of x is greater than 0, then your answer is just x. So for example, the absolute value of 3 is 3. It's just the number inside. And then if it's equal to 0, so if it's equal to 0, it's just 0. In other words, the absolute value of 0 is 0. And lastly, if it's less than 0, you make it negative. So if I have the absolute value of -2, it tells me to make that number, the x value on the inside, negative. So negative -2 is +2. So this kind of definition, number 3, kind of splits it into the 3 possibilities, a positive number, 0, or a negative number. So once again, if you need to pause this, write any of that down. This is on your pretest. You can write that on your pretest or just write it in your notes, whatever you want to do. All right, going on, it says draw a number line with the values of 7 and -2, then find the distance between the 2 points. So if I have -2, that would obviously be on the left, 7 would be on the right. And distance is defined, and I'm talking about distance on a one dimension number line, like x. This is like an x axis, right, or an x number line. We've learned about distance in an xy coordinate plane, but for this, I'm just talking about distance between 2 points on a number line. And it is defined as the absolute value of the difference. So two numbers, or it could be the other way. I'll show you both ways work. So you could do b minus a. It's the absolute value of the difference of the numbers. Okay. So here, if I did the absolute value of -2 minus 7, or you could do it the other way, the absolute value of 7 minus -2. So the difference of the two numbers and the absolute value of that. So the absolute value of -2 minus 7 would be -9. We know the absolute value of -9 is 9. And then here, 7 minus -2, we know that's plus, so that would be 9. And we know the absolute value of 9 is also just 9. So if you take the absolute value of the difference, you'll get the same answer. So the distance from here to here is 9 units. Now that was pretty obvious, but this can really help you out if it's, maybe not quite as obvious. Like if I have -3.741 and then 6.233, that's not quite as obvious. So in that case, you can just do the difference. So if I have 6.233 minus -3.741, we get to 9.974. That's how far away they are. Or you could do it the other way, like I said. So you could do -3.741 minus 6.233, and we get -9.974, but we know the absolute value of that is 9.974. And just for, you don't really need it here. Obviously, you should be able to do that in your head. But if at some point you do need the absolute value, whether it's a graph or, a more complex absolute value, it's under the math menu. And then number menu. And I'm hoping they get that Chromebook app so that yours will be exactly like mine. But the different calculators should have a way of doing absolute value as well. In that first option, there's absolute value. So absolute value of -9.974, for example, is 9.974. And these are just basic examples. Obviously, the absolute value of 3 is 3. The absolute value of -5 is is 5. And the absolute value of 2 is 2. Easy cheesy lemon squeezy. Moving on. So here we have the absolute value of -12. That would just be 12. Now here we have more going on than just one number. So you need to simplify the inside first, just like we would with the parentheses. So if I have 1 minus 5, that would be -4. But don't, or keep writing your absolute value bars. You have to keep writing them until you actually take the absolute value of that number. So once that's simplified, we have negative, but then the absolute value of -4 is just 4. Those are parentheses. So you don't write the absolute values anymore once you take the absolute value of that number, plus 4. So really, that's just -4 plus 4, which would come out to be 0. Okay. Number 3. Inside out, we simplify 4 plus -6. That would be -2. Minus 3 plus 3 is 6. But here we have the absolute value of -2, which is 2. It's positive. Minus, and the absolute value of 6 is 6. 2 minus 6 is -4. So pretty easy, pretty straightforward here, just simplifying absolute values. Number 4, we have a variable. Okay, so number 4, we have a variable. Now, the way that this works, we don't know what x is. So x has to stay in the bars. Okay, it's like we don't know if x has the coronavirus or not. So x has to stay quarantined inside of the absolute value bars. But any coefficients of x, we can go ahead and make those positive. So for example here, the absolute value of -x is kind of like the absolute value of -1 times x. Well, that's really what it is, right? And so we can think of that as the absolute value of -1 times the absolute value of x. And the absolute value of -1 is just 1. And then, like I said, we're going to keep x in the bars. So this whole thing just comes out to 1 absolute value of x. Plus, now the absolute value of 3 is just 3, but we can go ahead and put that outside of the quarantine because it has been taken the absolute value. And then this is just an x. It just stays inside. We don't know what x is. If x is negative, if x has the coronavirus, we have to keep it inside just to be sure because we don't know. And then minus, and then the absolute value of -5 is 5, but once again, I'm just going to keep the x inside. And now this is kind of like, they are like terms. 1 of something plus 3 of the same thing minus 5 of them. So that would be 4 minus 5 would be -1 absolute value of x, or just negative absolute value of x. But if you have a variable, you have to keep the bars in your answer. We don't know what x is. So in the case that we do find out what x is, we have to take the absolute value of it. Okay, now take a second. I want you to do number 5 on your own. So pause the video. So get good at practice. This will definitely be on exam 3. So go ahead and pause the video. Practice number 5. See if you can come up to the right answer, and then play it. And then I'll go ahead and do the example for you. All right, hopefully you got to an answer here. If you're not done yet, just repause it. Make sure you pause it. I want you to actually practice this. So this comes out to 2 absolute values of x plus 2, and then the coefficient of -1 just becomes +1, minus 5. The absolute value of 5 is 5, but there is a minus sign, but that doesn't mean that that's a -5. It just means that that's minus 5 absolute values of x. And then here we get 2 plus 2 is 4 minus 5, so we actually get negative absolute value of x again. All right, moving on. The last thing we have to do today is we just need to solve some absolute value equations, okay? So starting off here, it says, which number is the absolute value? And the absolute value is 4. That is the distance. Remember, absolute value is distance. So in this case, they're saying it has a distance of 4. What are we asked to find the absolute value of? X. We're asked to find the absolute value of x. So what this is asking me is what numbers x have a distance of 4 away from 0? So if you think about this, we actually have 2 answers because here's 0, 4 has a distance of 4, but so does -4 has a distance of 4. So x can be 2 different numbers. It could be 4, or it could be -4. And when you take the absolute value of either of those, you get a distance of 4. So this is about the most basic, absolute value equation that you could have. So for example, if I gave you the absolute value of x equals 9, x could be 2 things. X could be 9, or x could be -9. Okay. What about the absolute value of x equals -2? So what this is asking you is what numbers of x, have a distance of -2 away from 0? Now distance is never negative. We always consider distance to be positive. So if you ever see an absolute value by itself equal to a negative number, that is no solution. And we'll see some of those here in a little bit. All right, so what number could we set the absolute value of x equal to so that we would only have one solution? Because we just saw we're usually going to get 2. So the only answer would be, and you kind of saw it in that definition, is 0. There's only one number that's 0 units away from 0, and that is 0. Otherwise, we're always going to get 2 solutions, or no solutions like I showed you. So to solve an absolute value equation, we just isolate the absolute value by doing our inverse operations, okay? We never distribute into them. So unlike parentheses, we would never distribute into an absolute value, like 2x plus 2. So don't do that. No distributing. And let's just do this with an example here. So starting off with number 1, the absolute value is already by itself. There's nothing else on the left side except for the absolute value of 3x. It's equal to 9. 9's positive, so we know we're going to have solutions. If that was a negative 9, we could stop right there and say there's no solution. But it's a positive 9, so we're good. So what we're going to do, you're going to take what's inside the absolute value. So in this case, that is 3x. And whatever's inside the absolute value could come out to be 9, or it could come out to be negative 9. Either of those are possible. Because we know if we take the absolute value of 9, we get 9. If we take the absolute value of negative 9, we get 9. So 3x could be either of those. And then we just solve each of them like we would in Algebra 1. So in this case, we get x equals 3. That's one solution. And divide by 3 here. X equals negative 3. That's our other solution. So it's pretty obvious to see why these work, because if you put 3 in there, we get 3 times 3 is 9. We found the value of x that creates that makes the inside be 9. The absolute value of 9 is 9. But if we plug in negative 3, we get 3 times negative 3, which is negative 9. So we found the value of x that makes the inside negative 9, but we know the absolute value of negative 9 is 9. So both of those answers work. Okay, number 2, once again, the absolute value is by itself. There's nothing else on the left side except for the absolute value of 4x plus 2. So we can go straight to breaking this apart. We know that 4x plus 2 could be 10. And once again, that's a positive number, so that has to be positive for this to work. And then 4x plus 2 could also equal negative 10. Whatever that comes out to be, it could be 10 or negative 10. So we subtract 2 over here, we get 4x equals 8, divide by 4, so therefore x equals 2. And once again, if you need to pause to write stuff down, please do so. And over here, we subtract over 2, that would give us negative 12. Divide by 4, and we would get negative 3. So if you plug these in, if we plug in 2, 4 times 2 is 8, plus 2 is 10. The absolute value of 10 is 10. And if we plug in negative 3, that's the one that might maybe not be quite as obvious. 4 times negative 3 would be negative 12, plus 2 would be negative 10, but the absolute value of negative 10 is positive 10. So once again, you can see how both of those answers work. Okay, now number 3 is the first one where the absolute value is not by itself. So in order to get the absolute value by itself, you have to subtract 13 over. It's always the first step is get the absolute value by itself. So we get the absolute value of 2x minus 1 equals negative 10. Now, when the absolute value is by itself, before you break it apart into the two possibilities, you have to check and make sure the right side is positive, and it's not. Now, technically, you could break this apart, and algebra would give you two answers. Like, you could solve that if you set it equal to 10 and negative 10. But no matter what number you plug in for x, when you take the absolute value of it, it cannot equal a negative number. It's not possible. So you'll get answers if you don't pay attention, but they're not going to work because the absolute value of a number can't be negative 10. So this is no solution. So you have to keep an eye out for that. Okay. And then number 4, once again, the absolute value is not by itself. So we need to get it by itself by doing our inverse operation. So we add 8 over. So we get 2 times the absolute value of x plus 4 equals 20. And that's 2 times the absolute value. Remember, we don't distribute in. Rather than doing that, we want to undo it, right? We undo multiplication by dividing. So those 2's cancel out. We get the absolute value of x plus 4 equals 10. And once again, before you break it apart, you got to make sure that that number, when the absolute value is by itself, is positive. And that is a positive 10, so we're good. We can break it apart to get our two answers. So one possibility is x plus 4 could be 10, but x plus 4 could also be negative 10. And we subtract 4 over here, we get 6. That's one answer. Subtract 4 over here, we get negative 14. And you could plug those back into the original equation. You'll see that they both work. All right, so this is more practice. If you have the notes packet, and I'll put the PDF of the notes packet on Google Classroom so you can print that off if you have a printer. If you don't have a printer, go ahead and write these out. I would like for you to do each of these on your own for practice. And then I'm going to pause my video and write out all the correct work and the correct answers, and then you can check it. So I'm not going to go over each of these, but I want you to give it a try. So actually pause the video, and then I'll give you the answers to see how you did. Okay, so go ahead and pause it now. All right, here is my work and the answer. So on number 5, positive 8, it's good to go. Break it apart. I got x equals 3 and x equals negative 13. Number 6, I added 5 over, divided by 2. That got to a positive 9 on the right side, so good to go. Broke it apart. Got x equals 4 and x equals negative 5. Number 7, if you divide both sides by negative 2, the right side is still negative. That negative 4, an absolute value equals a negative number, is no solution. And then the last one, if you divide both sides by negative 3, that actually makes the right side become negative. So we have absolute value equals a negative. That's another no solution. So if you want to pause this to check the work, if you got something wrong, check your answers, do so. But that is the end of this lesson.